Susan Phillips, and I'm the Provost and Vice President of Academic Affairs at the University at Albany. And on behalf of the Rockefeller College and the University, I'd like to welcome you all to the first of 3 events that our college is doing entitled Navigating the Post-9/11 World. There's no question that this incredible event, the aftermath that we just considered tonight, has had a profound impact, from the mundane to the massive, from the personal to the political. As you know, our Rockefeller College has been a leading force in understanding the impact of important world events such as 9/11. And it's very fitting that the faculty, staff, and students of Rockefeller College to bring to you this evening this very special moment for reflection and dialogue for our community. It's my pleasure to introduce David Rousseau, the Dean of the College, to set the stage for our discussion ahead. David.
Good evening and welcome. The events of September 11th have had a profound impact on individuals, groups, and societies from around the world. Governments have fallen, terrorist organizations have been attacked, civil wars have been fought, and elections have been contested. Some of these changes are quite positive. Today, many girls in Afghanistan attend school on a regular basis. Some of these changes have not been positive. Transparency International now ranks Afghanistan and Iraq as 2 of the most corrupt countries in the world. As a professor of political science, specializing in international relations, I've witnessed 2 events in the last 25 years that have fundamentally transformed my field of study. The first was the implosion of the Soviet Union. The second was September 11th. These events were transformative both for American society and societies around the world. The events forced the world onto a new trajectory. They forced societies, including our own, to alter policies to deal with the new landscape. Both events have created great uncertainty for us. They've created periods of unease, periods in which there are new dangers, but they also have created new opportunities. Just as we will be studying the end of the Cold War for decades to come, I believe that we will be sorting out the implications of the tragic events in New York, Washington, and Pennsylvania for many years. The 10th anniversary of 9/11 is a solemn occasion. It provides a moment for us to pause and reflect on the events and their aftermath. Part of this reflection will be introspective. How do I, as an individual, relate to the changes in policy? How are my beliefs changed? How has my behavior changed? But part of the reflection will be collective, through a dialogue. In any democratic society, we must sit back and reflect on events that have occurred. And in our case, we have to reflect on the events of 9/11 through the lens of the last decade. We're gathered here tonight to be part of this dialogue. I suspect we're not going to walk out of the auditorium in perfect agreement. It's common knowledge that our society remains deeply divided on many issues related to the American response to the attacks. However, I hope that civil discussion, thoughtful listening, and careful reflection will allow us to take stock of what has changed in the last 10 years and what needs to change in the next 10. I want to thank you for joining us tonight for our kickoff event, 9/11, 10 years later, a dialogue with the community. We've assembled a wonderful panel, and I believe it'll be a stimulating discussion. I'd like to thank the New York State Museum, the New York State Writers Institute, and Susan Arbiter for helping plan this event. And before turning the program over to our moderator, I'd like us to take a moment to remember those that lost their lives 10 years ago, with music played by Area Beth chamber players with musicians from the Albany Symphony Orchestra.
to our community dialogue, 9/11, 10 years later. I was here at the museum yesterday looking at the World Trade Center Rescue Recovery Response exhibits, the largest permanent collection of objects from the World Trade Center Ground Zero that there is. And Cliff Siegfried, the director, said something to me that just, well, as a broadcaster, I should probably say struck me, indeed struck me, but it actually freaked me out. And that was that the people who initially came to the exhibit in 2002, many of them cried. In fact, the staff at the museum had to be trained to deal with grief and grieving people walking through the exhibits. Just the simplest, most everyday object that was collected from the Freshkill landfill that was on display could spur, you know, a crying jag or people even falling on the floor. That's changed though. The kids, whereas before they were concerned that it was too much for children, kids today have a very different response. It's not the kind of response that someone of 2002 would have. It's more of that arm's length, non-personal, this is history response, the way maybe you and I would have walking through a museum display on World War II. It's not personal to them anymore. And it makes you think about how time is relentless, but time is also giving us an opportunity to heal and reflect and think about how we've changed, and that's what this conversation is about today. How we've changed individually, institutionally, how the media have changed, how our communities have changed. And we have a great panel here. Each of the panelists are going to be taking one of those elements of change and delving into it. I'm hoping that we can do this in an informal way, because this isn't your typical sort of community dialogue. I mean, I think everyone was personally touched by this. It's not an arm's length thing. It didn't happen to somebody else. So if you want to ask questions, just please give us about a half hour, and then we're going to open up the floor. The rest of it's going to be for questions, okay? Is there a microphone for people to come up? So we'll get one. Okay. So the people here tonight are people that you might know personally, but you know them in your heart. You know Mark Shannon, for example. He's the director of exhibits here at the museum. You know him because he was the driving force behind the exhibit I hope all of you have seen. This is the Rescue Recovery Response exhibit here at the museum. He was the guy who spent months scouring the Freshkills landfill for artifacts from the World Trade Center. Little things that make you that take your breath away when you see them, because they're just such small, everyday things. He's the person who basically generated the energy to create this exhibition, which has spawned a lot of other exhibits, and is also sort of the mother or father to New York Remembers.
You did say this was in
Well, yeah, okay.
I'm sorry about that.
Thank you. Who are you, by the way? What do you do? Okay, good. Thanks. So Mark is also on the board of the New World Trade Center Memorial and is in contact with the 9/11 families, and has is still in contact with a lot of people from the FBI and police departments. Kenneth Jackson's name might not be familiar, but I bet his face is familiar. Officially, Kenneth is the director of the Herbert H. Lehman Center for American History and the Jacques Barzoon Professor of History and Social Sciences at Columbia. But I think a lot of PBS viewers know him as the guy who was featured in the 1995 Rick Burns film, New York, a documentary. And you were good, by the way. Jackson is considered an expert on urban geography, and every year he takes his students on an all-night bike ride through New York City. But apparently we cannot audit that. who's happy to be a member of it. Conversely, while you might not know Jamie Terabay's face, I'll bet that when she says hello, you recognize her Australian accent from her days as the Baghdad bureau chief for NPR. Jamie is of Lebanese descent, born in Australia, fluent in both French and Arabic. Quite the gourmet, I understand. She lived in the Middle East for many, many years. Currently, she is the managing editor of National Security and Foreign Affairs for National Journal. She's based in Washington. As a foreign correspondent, though, for the Associated Press, and then, of course, for NPR, she has reported and lived in some of the world's most turbulent places. Apparently, she's driven in Beirut and southern Lebanon and Humvee over IEDs, and she's quite the exceptional driver, as well as reporter. She was also on the NPR team that won the DuPont Columbia Journalism Award for coverage of the Iraq War, and she wrote about her experiences covering the Intifada between the Palestinian Intifada, called A Crazy Occupation I Witnessed to an Intifada. It's great to have you here. Listen to you for a long time. I've been reading Paul Grandal for a long time, like I know you all have. He is our Paul Grandal because his writing is renowned and, well, he's ours. He's an award-winning journalist whose stories about things that just make you tear up. Poppy's addiction, the fourth world, I remember, the Malawi stories, Ground Zero, all of these in the Times Union are just remarkable. He's one of those rare, he's among the rare breed of journalists whose depth is as deep as his interests are broad. That makes sense somewhere in another galaxy. Anyone who's read his book Mayor Corning knows how fantastic he is, and his work has appeared in lots of other places, although we consider him our own. Such rabs as Newsday and the New York Times Book Review. Finally, you might not know Victor Sal, but you should. I do. He is an associate professor of political science at the Rockefeller College and the director of the Center for Policy Research. It's his work as the co-director of the Center for Violent Conflict that has brought his work to the attention of the Department of Homeland Security, in a good way. as well as the National Consortium for the Study of Terrorism and Responses to Terrorism. His research focuses on the choice of violence by non-state organizational actors, among other areas that we won't get into, like the stuff he does for DARPA on threat reduction. That must pay the bills. Again, we're going to talk for about 30 minutes, and then we're going to open up the conversation to everyone, because this is a community conversation. And I wanted to begin with Mark Shannon. I think it's probably appropriate to do that since we're in his house today. Why is it important that we remember something like this? Not we individually, but we as a society with institutions like the State Museum.
Yeah, I could use this. As you mentioned, we just opened a huge slate of exhibitions across the state called New York Remembers, and Governor Cuomo worked with us and his staff to do this, and we had a lot of discussion about the word remember rather than not forgetting. We think remembering is a better thing, and it made me think of a conference I participated in Normandy, France last year. It was about memory and remembering, and there was academics and psychologists and historians there, and there was great discussion. And they're very proud of themselves when they realized the first point was we had to know something to remember it. So, okay, so we knew something, that was the first step. But what really struck me, and there was some people up from the Holocaust museums and the death camps and things there, and this relates very much to the 9/11 exhibition experience, is that you have to really feel something. You have to have a tangible experience, a sensation, and that's what memory is. That you've been there, and or been in the presence of something. And one of the powers that a museum has is that we deal with objects and we deal with voices. of this project, which was extraordinary in many ways, is that we worked on it immediately after the attacks. We began collecting and talking with people over these last 10 years that have brought life to these objects. And we've exhibited them and brought them out to places, and hopefully forming a fabric of memory and remembrance with people as they move forward. Exhibitions and museums, we think, are a platform for discussions, for experience. When we did an exhibition in France, we asked people, where were you on September 11th? And that was a great thing that people would talk about. We learned that this wasn't an attack on New York and Washington, it was an attack on the United States, and it was really an attack on the world that we think over 1 billion people witnessed. So we're sort of in the business of remembering and memory and making a platform for people to do so.
And it's important. How do you think we change as we come through the exhibit? We see engine number 9, we look at the flag. Does that change us individually?
I think it does, and I think, and we think, as you mentioned, even the smallest object and the smallest story, people relate to a face more than they do a number. And so if you see a missing poster in this tangible sense. We've had people tell us they can smell things in the gallery that smells like ground zero. We're pretty sure there's nothing there that truly does. So I think there's a sensory, there's a memory that you have when you go forward and know more about what happened. It's an enriching experience. We do worry about and think about, and Ken and I were talking about this a little bit, and you touched on it, this generation that wasn't there and can now maybe not remember. And then we're teaching them and telling them something about history and what happened. Pretty soon 9/11 is going to be like my great-uncle's World War II experience, which was once removed, and it's a grainy photograph and a film and that. And because most of us are the age who have been there and known this, it's a very different experience. It has turned also, the one other point I wanted to make, and Cliff maybe was touching on this, is that the experience with the material in these objects had turned from a sacred, sort of from a sacred into a historical experience for many, many people. And that's not entirely true. We still see people broken to tears when they see a picture of a young woman who was killed or a small object. But there's a general currency of this that we're seeing happen that is different than 9 years ago when we started looking at the pieces.
So why don't we talk about terrorism with Victor Saul. Bin Laden is dead. Have our enemies changed?
Yes and no. I'm an academic.
You know,
I'm
I
always,
hate that.
yes, I think that our enemies have changed in 2 ways. Those enemies that existed before 9/11, many of them, because of pressure from the U.S. government, have changed shape. The structure of some of these terrorist organizations has changed dramatically because of pressure from the U.S. government. But on the other hand, the invasions in Afghanistan and the invasions in Iraq created a whole slew of new enemies and diffused ideologies that perhaps would not have diffused in the same way. In Afghanistan, there was a removal of this black hole of sovereignty that was there before 9/11, and that was a help. But we moved from Afghanistan very quickly into Iraq, which allowed al-Qaeda to rebuild, in Pakistan to gain more strength, and allowed the Taliban in many areas to come back. We went to Iraq. We went to a country that was not involved in 9/11. We invaded it. We took out a very oppressive government, but did not have the infrastructure in place to create stability and a reasonable occupation. And this created, and we also fired all the people who knew how to have guns. And we fired the army of Iraq. And so we created another black hole of sovereignty that created a whole host of problems.
So even though you're saying that, you know, the Bush administration spent a lot of time talking about preparing for this war in Iraq, they weren't prepared.
They were prepared to conquer Iraq. They were not prepared to govern Iraq.
So just like in the former Yugoslavia, if you take the giant force of leadership out,
You better be prepared to have an awful lot of napkins to wipe stuff up. And we did not bring enough napkins.
And, what was that?
It's hard back to psychology.
Yeah, to psychology.
Well, no, but also this is just power. It's not just psychology,
I
it's power
agree.
and control.
It's a social issue in this country, which it is in every other country. I'm sorry.
Do,
You're right.
do you think that, New York is still a target? And, you know, if New York was a target under Bin Laden and Al-Qaeda because it's a financial center and they were, you know, ultra-religious, what did you call them, Mr. Leftist?
No, they're not leftists. From the 70s and 80s, most terrorist ideology was motivated by leftist ideology and ethno-nationalist ideology, and there was a feeling that you really wanted to get a lot of press. So if you were hijacked on a plane, you had a real likelihood of surviving as long as you were polite to the terrorists. Not necessarily, but a likelihood of surviving. 9/11 and the religious ideology that rose after the fall of the Soviet Union had a different perspective. Not only did they have a terrestrial audience, they also had a cosmic audience. And it wasn't only about getting press, it was also about killing lots and lots of people. So the whole aspect of what a hijacking meant fundamentally shifted.
All right, so why New York City?
Well, Susan, if you were a terrorist, where would you attack? And I'm not asking that rhetorically.
You know, it depends on who I would hate.
If you hate America, New York's a great place to attack. It's the financial center, it's got the big symbols, Statue of Liberty, all these other exciting places. Washington, D.C. is also a great place to attack.
If the threat has changed, if the people who hate us and the terrorists have changed, have the target that they have the targets changed?
Yes.
Is New York still a target?
New York, well, the targets are the same, but America is different. I remember having spent quite a number of years in Israel, coming back to the United States in the late 90s, and going into the Boston Public Library, and there was a police or security man standing there checking bags. So my wife and I went up to him to give him our bag before we went into the library to be checked. And he looked at us like we were crazy. He said, I don't check bags going in, I check bags going out to make sure you're not stealing books. And I turned to my wife and I said, this is a blessed country. And on 9/11, I remember holding my 5-month-old in my hands, watching TV, and I said, this is a different place now. And so with all of the problems that DHS has and the TSA has, we are now a country that is much more aware of these kinds of things, that has invested resources, both good resources and bad. We now have departments of Homeland Security in the states. New York State is one of the places that has really taken a lead in creating fusion centers and all other components that are communicating between the federal, state, and local government to pay attention to these dangers in a way that on September 10th of 2001 simply didn't exist.
I want to continue to pursue the idea that New York City is changed in some way. Has it changed, Kenneth Jackson, in the way that we expected it to change 10 years ago?
Well, after the attack, many people predicted that skyscrapers were over. People would not want to ride in subways anymore because it was scary. That there would be a mass exodus for the city. And I remember realtors in Vermont telling me exactly that. Indeed, I knew of people who moved out of the city to the distant suburbs because of it. But the real story is not that at all, because prices in the middle of the city have gone up much more than the suburbs. You may have seen the story about how hard it is to get into private schools in New York City. Clearly, the broad feeling of families is that the city is safe, and people are not afraid. There have been 22 skyscrapers since 9/11. Prices are up, so I think in the broader sense, the city has not changed. This nation has changed. Probably, and by the way, just the number of people who are alive every year in New York City who didn't become homicide victims. If we had the homicide statistics of the early 1990s, that would almost be the World Trade Center every year or two. So it's vastly safer in terms of, even if you include the World Trade Center, that becomes, so that's one thing. So of course it's changed. So you can't have a is a giant hole in the sky, or was. There's security barriers all over. You can't walk into a skyscraper now without somebody taking your picture and looking at your ID. So there are these kind of daily nuisances that in some ways, I think, have hurt the city. In other words, the city is about openness, it's about interaction, it's about free interchange. And when you start sticking monkey wrenches into that, I think it hurts what a real city is. So I don't think it's escaped without problems. But I think basically the story is what we thought would happen didn't happen.
As in a more micro way, have any of the neighborhoods around Ground Zero changed? Tribeca, the financial district?
Well, the long-term trend in New York since at least 1920 was for the decline of Lower Manhattan and the rise of Midtown Manhattan. That had been happening probably by 1920, and that had been continuing. There are about 450 neighborhoods in New York City. It's hard to think of a single one that's worse off now than it was in 2001. And I've made myself unpopular by saying this, but if I were to say one, it would be Lower Manhattan. Just because of all the barricades, all the ripped up streets, everything else, but the population's doubled and there are grocery stores and life down there. So the neighborhoods are basically, now, this is just in the last 10 years. What will happen in the next 10 or 20 or 30 years? All bets are off. We don't know the future. But certainly looking back from this perspective of 10 years, it's remarkable how well the city has done.
There was a poll, I think, just released today by Quinnipiac maybe, that said New Yorkers are expecting another attack, but until then, it's just life as usual.
Well, just think if you knew that there was going to be an attack on 9/11 and you were flying, the odds are still 1,000 to 1 in your favor, you won't be on it. Suppose you knew there'd be a bomb in Grand Central or in some subway. The chances of it going off exactly while you're walking past are still thousands to 1 against it. So it's a vast city with millions of people. The chances of it happening to you are still low. And so I think what's amazing is when you look at Grand Central, and you see these teeming people, and you realize that any of us could carry a suitcase in there and blow something up. Obviously people are saying, you know, I'm going to go with the odds. And I'm still going to live my life and not be afraid. I think most people are afraid or realize there is a risk, but it's a risk that we're willing to run. Because if you're afraid to do anything, then you really have lost the battle.
You were on your way to New York City on a train on 9/11/2001, Paul. Obviously, you didn't know it was going to happen. How did it, how did your life change from that moment?
I mean, I'm a reporter, a journalist. I was going down on another story, actually an interesting historical story, the Tweed Courthouse, which has been restored by a local architectural firm. It was a great chance to get out of the office for the day. And it was a beautiful day. I didn't even bring a jacket. I had a polo shirt and my khakis, and they couldn't free up a photographer, so they said, take your camera. I had a camera, a roll of film, a notepad, and a pen. My wife was pretty upset. I didn't have a cell phone. I'm kind of old school, so I was just going down on the train and started sort of hearing a chatter and a buzz. And at Yonkers, I could look out the window and saw smoke coming out of the World Trade Center.
What time was this?
It was probably, at that time, it was probably about 9:30.
So this is just
9:15, yeah. And then some people said, and one's flown into the Pentagon too, and there was this kind of buzz building, and the conductor stopped the train and said, there's been some emergency at the World Trade Center, you have 1 minute to decide, get off the train, somehow we'll get you back to Albany, or we have to clear the track, you're going into Penn Station, we don't know what to expect. Just about everybody got off the train, but my job was to go in to see what was going on, so I went in, and I knew it was bad the minute the train pulled in, because Penn Station at a little before 10 o'clock in the morning was deserted. And I got up to the street level, I said, this is real bad, because people were huddled on the sidewalks, and there was no taxis, no cars in the street, just people coming up the street. And I still didn't know what happened. You just look up and it's a beautiful blue sky, like the most beautiful day you've ever seen, and it looks like another beautiful day in Manhattan. But I started going against the flow and got lower, and by the time I got about halfway down, people started showing in the their suits, you know, and debris and tattered. And I tried to talk to people, but they were so traumatized and crying, nobody could talk. And I got lower and lower, and finally got to very close to Building 7, which was smoking and teetering, that 47-story building that hadn't fallen. And while I was walking, the second tower fell, and you could not hear a thing. I mean, you're in a canyon. I just looked up, it's just a beautiful day. I know something terrible is happening, but you just have blinders when you're in that city, and you don't have a cell phone, and you just know people are traumatized, and I knew a plane had hit the tower. So, I mean, from then it was just kind of a blur in ash all day, you know. Started at your ankles and got up above, you know, halfway up your calf. It was thick and it was black, syrupy smoke. And people, I finally found firefighters who were just distraught. They knew how bad it had been and how many they'd lost. And I just started doing what we do. We talked to people. I finished my roll of film in like 5 minutes, and I spent 5 days there reporting. What amazed me is by that afternoon, they kind of pushed us back to 14th Street, which became the barrier right up the West Side Highway there. And people were out jogging, rollerblading, pushing their babies in strollers, 2 miles away. That's almost exactly 2 miles. And that's why New York is the greatest city. And what this story to me became quickly was a story of courage and resilience and ennoblement. The people that went in there right after they had fallen, I mean, I was sort of pushed aside by iron workers and other security people digging with pickaxes in their bare hands trying to find survivors. And I went up to St. Vincent's Hospital. The whole sidewalk and the whole street was covered with doctors and nurses and anyone who could help, waiting for survivors, and there were no survivors. And it was, I mean, this day really emotional to recall it, but the courage you saw in people, just selflessness, just going in there to help, like the firefighters and the police officers did. It was, you know, really powerful. And it goes on. I mean, Mark and Craig Williams here in the State Museum who've collected all this. I went many times back with them over the months and years. And I just got off the phone an hour and a half ago with another widow. I've been interviewing victims' families all this week. We had 9 families in our area right here. I've sat in their living rooms, and some have kind of moved on, and some start crying the minute you start talking to them. It just wells up in me. I mean, I'm human, you know. I'm there to report and document and to do my job, but I was also scared and moved and crying that day and everything, you know, every single emotion. It was just, it was something.
I don't, this isn't crass, but there was a moment when a lot of reporters who were covering this story became very emotionally involved. How could you not be? You're human, and your humanity is intact. But there was an overwhelming wave of Americanism and the wearing of the American flag. Has journalism changed and how we cover ourselves at war since then?
Sure, I think it has. I mean, obviously the 24-hour news cycle, the blogosphere, everybody's tweeting every time they take another breath. I mean, it's so instant and so compressed now. And it really wasn't then. You had the TV images, but you didn't have quite, I mean, in 2001, the blogosphere was in its infancy, and it wasn't, you know, second by second as much, but...
I mean, the jingoism, you know, has that gone away to some extent? Or if we're attacked again, are we again going to see that kind of, you don't say anything bad about America?
I didn't see that among the journalists I knew. I mean, I saw that a lot with some of the victims' families, and I mean, I think, you know, the journalists I know really they're doing a job, and they remove yourself. I mean, you feel part of it, but I never felt like it was my story. I mean, I'm a pane of glass to let people tell their story. I don't really tell my story. I've been asked to since then, but it wasn't my story. I walked into something by accident, and it was my job to record and to let our readers sort of feel what it felt like to be there and to witness that moment. So I never felt it was my story. Even talking to families now, it's difficult. You feel strange and kind of awkward, but that's part of our job to it's still our story in this region. It touched those 9 families directly, and it ripples out throughout this audience, obviously, and the country and the world. Everyone has their experience and connection to it.
I was referring more to some of the network news.
Oh, okay,
News networks.
yeah.
So, Jamie, what is different in how America is perceived around the world now? We had this huge opportunity to leverage this goodwill, which didn't happen. And here we are 10 years later. Are we still America the Great in some of these quarters, or are we even lower than we were?
You know, it's so sad because this tragedy in the last 10 years has been completely overshadowed by the cost that it led to, the consequences of it. And I think this is one of the reasons why, you know, younger generations hold it at a distance, because for some people, 9/11 led to 2 wars. It led to 5,000-6,000 American dead. It led to hundreds of thousands of Iraqi and Afghan civilians dead. It led to the current economic crisis that we have here, and it's very hard to disassociate all of that. And then it makes it less personal. And it's really sad because it takes away from the tragedy of what happened 10 years ago. And I was based in Jerusalem at the time, and I was actually on holiday. I was on a boat off the coast of Turkey. I was having a fantastic time, and then it was really difficult because it was coming over the shortwave radio. It was about the internet being in its infancy. It was on the shortwave radio, and our Turkish dive masters were saying, someone had flown a plane into one of the twin towers, and all they could think of was, what an idiot. They did not see the tower. And then almost immediately when we heard about the second one, you know, everybody's reaction was, this is not an accident. This was Bin Laden. And the first reports that we were getting, which were completely horrifying, that it wasn't 3,000, it was 45,000 people, because those were the numbers of the people who were expected to have been at their desks at 9 o'clock on a Tuesday morning, checking their email, having their coffees, catching up on, you know, the work day. I mean, it's just, but I think that the sense following on from that, you know, Le Monde came out the next day with a front page that said, we are all Americans. There was definitely a sense across the world that this isn't just an attack on one people. If it could happen to the United States, it could happen to any of us. And this was a threat that we had to deal with. And I think that the support and the sympathy that this country had going into Afghanistan was not questioned at all. It was not at all contested. But you're absolutely right. I mean, that goodwill was completely squandered when it came to the Iraq War, because nobody saw that. No one saw the connection. And to even hear the administration at the time try to equal Saddam Hussein with Al-Qaeda in any kind of way made no sense. And you thought, come on, I mean, people will figure it out. I mean, it made no sense. It made no sense to anybody watching on the other side of the world. You thought, surely, you know, with Colin Powell, and he seemed like a very sensible person, and, you know, when they go to talk to the UN, and the idea that they went through this farce of trying to, you know, call on everyone to help them and say they were doing this because they had proof and evidence and all the rest of it, and it was just, it was so squandered. And people ask me, would we still be in Afghanistan today if we hadn't gone into Iraq? Would we not have caught Osama bin Laden 5 years ago if we hadn't gone into Iraq?
Because the resources would have been.
Because he was in Tora Bora in December 2001. This could have been over. This could have been over by 2002. And the resources were diverted because they were getting ready for an invasion into Iraq. And you're absolutely right, Victor, when you talk about the black hole that existed in Afghanistan at the time. We could have made a difference there. But to expend resources, go after the Taliban, try to attack Al-Qaeda, and then leave. go to Iraq. Afghanistan becomes the forgotten war. I'm sure you all remember that. And then to come back and say, okay, we're done with the Iraq, mission accomplished. What that mission was, by the way, is completely unclear. It remains a mystery. And then to say, okay, now we're going to go back to Afghanistan because that's where the real fight is. And you've lost it. You've lost the people there. You've lost the world. There's so many strategic mistakes made that this country just completely squandered. I mean, it's a tragedy on so many levels because that is the consequence and the cost of something that should have remained a moment that no one should ever forget because of this universal threat to everyone. And it was taken away. I mean, the people who suffered, the victims of 9/11, have had this taken away from them because of Iraq and Afghanistan. And that to me is the true tragedy here.
It was diluted, not diluted, but diluted.
Yeah. And I wanted to, I mean, when you talked about whether New York would have any more attacks, and we talked about that before, a lot of the reporting that we found is, would there be another large-scale attack like, hijacking a plane? And largely the reporting that we've seen that we've talked to people about is that no, the most likely scenario would be like the Mumbai hotel shootings, where they, with the Times Square bombing, they put a car, it blows up, they divert the resources there, and meanwhile they attack a hotel lobby and they go room to room or something like that. So it would be much more small scale, but a lot more manpower, that sort of thing. But the NYPD is incredibly well equipped and well trained and ready for that kind of scenario.
That's certainly one of the big changes.
And when you talk about attacking Americans, one of the biggest reasons why Iraq just sort of descended into this chaotic situation was because suddenly there were all the Americans anybody wanted to attack were right there. And people would travel from Saudi to Syria over the border and get paid $10, $100 to fire an RPG at an American Humvee. So you didn't need to go to New York to attack America, you could do it in Iraq. And you can still do it there, you can still do it in Afghanistan. The toll in Afghanistan last month has been unbelievable. And those IEDs are getting more and more sophisticated. The danger is still there. There's no counterinsurgency that's winning over the people if the American troops are still being targeted in the way that they are now. So, I mean, on so many levels, and I could talk about this all night and bore you to tears, but it's just been a complete disaster.
Maybe you can just talk briefly about a question that I heard my mother's neighbor ask. Why do they hate us?
I'll give you a classic example of, and it is something that Victor, I'm sure you've met with in your travels as well. I'm trying to remember, just who do you work for? Oh, I work for, NPR or AP. Are they American? Yes, they are. And they're like, why do they say those things about us? Why do they think that, why they call us all terrorists? And then, why do they support Israel? And then the next question is, do you think I could get a green card? Because I'd like to live in America.
Can I jump in here, Susan? So research that I've done with Carl Rethmeyer, who's in the audience, one of the biggest predictors of why terrorist organizations will attack U.S. and U.S. interests is, does America have troops in that country, and that country is not a democracy? So if America has troops in a country that's a democracy, there's no correlation. But if America has troops in a country that's not a democracy, i.e. supporting that country that's not a democracy, then there's a much higher likelihood that terrorist organizations in that country are going to target U.S. interests and U.S. individuals. And that's a price we pay for various kinds of policy initiatives that we have.
And have we done the, speaking of psychology, the introspection and made the changes that we've needed to make as a country in terms of our foreign policy?
No. I think we still are fundamentally very deep. I studied the Cold War. David Rousseau mentioned that that big change in 1991. We had the Cold War, and then we had this unipolar moment Since 9/11, we've been in the 9/11 period, and we're still in the 9/11 period. We're still involved in two different countries. We're still spending an awful lot of money in these two different countries, and people are going to be killed by the pictures of Abu Ghraib for a very long time. And we have not made fundamental changes in the Bush administration or in the Obama administration. The big change so far was the surge, and however you want to explain it. But that's not a big enough change for what needs to happen. And I would say something that's very important is, and we had talked about this earlier, I think the most important anti-terrorist legislation this country has ever passed is the 1965 Civil Rights Act. And I think that sometimes we forget that. And when we move away from treating everybody equally and giving them credit for being the individuals they are, to differentiating people because they're this or they're that, we increase the very kind of grievance that is going to get us into more trouble.
We're going to go to the audience in a moment. I just real quickly, Kenneth, do you think that when you're forced to live with people who look different than you, who are different, who've maybe grown up with different values, like in a big melting pot like New York City, that you're forced to get along?
Well, I think the United States in general, and New York City in particular, are experiments. Can people who are different in every possible way live together in relative peace, not in love, but in peace? And I think generally the answer has been yes. I mean, when you think of former Yugoslavia and the cutting of throats by the Croats, the Serbs, and the Bosnians, they all were in New York, they don't do it. Pakistanis and Indians who are about to create a nuclear war with Kashmir, they all live in New York, they all live in Queens, they all live in Jackson Heights. And somehow they manage
With
to...
good food.
The Jews and the Arabs, you know, the Atlantic Avenue in Brooklyn. You know, it's sort of like, you know, we're here for a different reason. And let's leave those other things behind. And I think that it is a model for us. And in some ways, I think the reason New York and the World Trade Center were chosen was because those towers are symbols that aspiration is an American value. It wasn't the minarets, it wasn't the steeple of Trinity Church, it's these tall buildings. It's all mixed up, you know, think of all the different peoples who died there, men and women and stuff like this. The city represents toleration, and many people don't believe that. That's a value that we tend to hold here, but you could get an argument from a lot of people. So I think that in a sense they chose, in other words, they weren't just trying to kill people. You could fly an airplane into the University of Michigan Stadium on a Saturday afternoon and probably kill at least that many people. But there's some symbolic value in attacking the very center of the American media, financial, cultural capital, and killing as many people as you can. And they got the attention they wanted. Look at that. I mean, morning news, all the networks are on the air right there at the moment. You can see it live in Turkey. In fact, the amazing thing is that this is a different story, but the firemen in Tower 1 did not know that Tower 2 had fallen. And in Turkey, you did know. Around the world, you knew it. But the firefighters 100 yards away in the other building did not have communications at all.
Just one more minute for Mark and Paul. Mark, the ideas that we're talking about are so enormous and difficult to wrap our minds around, which is probably why we need the arts. I'm just listening to the beautiful music that we heard introducing the panel. It sort of gives you a moment to reflect and breathe and makes us aware of the best of ourselves. Is there a way in which the institutions like museums or artwork is able to direct that better part of ourselves into something more positive
Well,
after tragedy?
well, 2 points. One thing, and for this year, there's an exhibition about to open. It's not open yet because we're here. Come back Saturday. We decided to use fine art to think about September 11th and a place and a time, and there's an exhibition we're doing of art made at the towers, right up to the latest piece was on September 10th, 2001, a video piece a woman did out the window on the 91st floor. And I do think that speaks to and expresses something to the viewer that looking at historic objects doesn't, that you can express, and that there's a humanity in this that we all read to. Some of it takes a little more work to understand, some of it doesn't. Then there's the tens of thousands of cubic feet of expressions that people all over the world did after September 11th. It's a whole other thing I don't necessarily consider fine art. But it is a purpose of the museum, I think, to look back and to look ahead at art that's made of a time and in a place. And I happen to think, if I think of 50 years and 100 years from now, the art that was made then and now is going to be something people are looking at just as much as the artifacts, because it'll define a time that we're in the middle of still. So how you look at it. The other thing is, just to point to this other thing you're making that had me thinking. In museums, and we tell a story of what happened. It's harder to tell why something happened, because you start walking the line between editorialism and do you know what I mean? And this is a particularly difficult story to tell in a clear way to the visitor when they came here. We say, this is what happened beginning at 8:46 a.m. Never mind, it's hard to tell about the terrorists, especially in New York, even upstate New York, that have pictures of them in a museum. We struggle with that. But that's the other thing, 10 years later, we're still actually wrestling with, is why.
Paul, the spirit of America, has it changed? It just seems like we might not have the same respect for certain American institutions that we did have.
Yeah, I think, I teach a class, freshman level class called Culture, Diversity, and the Human Condition at University of Albany, and I've taught there for several years, and my students now we just talked about it on Tuesday night in class. They were in 3rd grade, and most of them had stories of not really knowing, not understanding, their parents were keeping things from them, and they want to know. You know, they need to know. A big part of what spurred this great effort with Mark and the museum was Governor Cuomo's 16-year-old daughters. I mean, he's talked about that. They were 6 years old. My kids are 21 and 16 now. They were just little kids then. So this 10 years, there's now a whole group of young people that really want to know and need to know. And I think that's why these documentaries that are coming out, these TV programs, we're doing a special section on Sunday in the Times Union. New York Times will have, I'm sure, an incredible presentation on Sunday. It's important because these students who are now 18, 19, 20, 21, college, want to know, and they haven't really either bothered or known since then. But I also find, I've had to cover this every year. It's been kind of my beat, you know. It's just something, because I was there on another story. It's my story now. So every year, you look for the local stories. And years 2, 3, and 4, there were a lot of church events and prayer services, but then by 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, it faded away to a whisper around here. And it's coming back bigger, as big this year from everything I've heard and talked to and felt as the first year. So there's almost like a collective guilt, like, man, we've forgotten that already in 10 years. Everyone's so busy and short attention spans, but I really felt years 4 through 9, it almost faded away to just the smallest background noise in this region. We're 150 miles, you know, other than those 9 families and the people that I've interviewed over the years, first responders and things from here, it's removed for a lot of people. You know, it's hard to relive that every year and go back to that frightening, sorrowful, sad place, but this year is, even here and all around the country, I think will be as big as the first anniversary. That's what I'm feeling.
Well, thank you all. I want to open this up to the people in the audience. I think we have about a half hour to talk with you and answer questions or just hear what you have to say.
Does the capture and elimination of Osama bin Laden, who clearly said and admitted several times that he was responsible, carried it out, wanted it to happen, does that make a difference in our feelings? Is this closure?
tell you all the families of victims that I've talked to here. I asked them that question. They said it won't bring my son back. It did not register for them. It made no difference. It didn't offer closure. It was too little, too late for them. Across the board, that's what people told me.
Victor, you said Bin Ladenism is not dead.
Bin Ladenism is not dead. I think that in terms of closure, I'm going to echo what you said. It's too little, too late. Had he been killed in 2003 or 2004, I think it would have made a very large difference to Al-Qaeda and to America. I think it's an important act. I think it has some impact on Al-Qaeda, but the constant attacks by the United States government on Al-Qaeda's middle management has had a larger impact, and Al-Qaeda has had time to franchise. And so it's just 5 or 6 years later than it should have been, and as Jamie said, probably could have been had the government really kept its eye on the ball.
Yes, I wonder if Osama bin Laden was one of our biggest supporters when the Russians were in Afghanistan. We wanted to get the Russians out of Afghanistan, and Osama was working for us to bring people in from countries like Saudi Arabia and get them out. I mean, one example, Saudi Arabia is, as far as dictatorships, like number 6 on the list, and they get most of their weapons from us. So I mean, I agree with you, sir, that I think that one of the problems is that when we support dictatorships in the world, this is going to happen, and unfortunately it seems that we are being, there's greed, because we really, unfortunately, want a good price on gas at the pump.
It's a great point.
America, this is one of the first wars that America's ever fought without raising taxes. We fought
Why
it.
is that important?
We asked a certain segment of society to take an enormous burden upon themselves, and the rest of us, our burden was to shake their hands and say thank you if we remembered. And we were not asked to raise taxes. We were not asked to do pretty much anything. Our taxes were cut. Our gasoline cost the same. We have a commitment to Saudi Arabia because we're heroin addicts. And I don't mean heroin, white heroin, I mean black heroin. Yeah. And as long as that is the case, and as long as the political class in America is not willing to tell the American people we need to pay a price to change this, it's going to be a problem. And the invasion of Iraq, the first invasion of Iraq, I always thought it was funny to say that. Maybe come up on the second invasion. The first invasion of Iraq led bin Laden to actually change his perspective, because you had infidels in Arabia. I'm not sure he'd want to call it Saudi Arabia, in Arabia, and this made him see America now as the enemy. That was one of the primary causes. Another cause was America's support for Israel.
I just want to jump in because we're experiencing something now called the Arab Spring, and America has another opportunity to do the right thing. Jamie, what is the right thing? And is that dependent upon which country we're talking about?
It's been, for me, tremendously gratifying to be watching the Arab Spring, now the Arab Summer, and if nothing else, that should tell people that unlike Osama bin Laden and Al-Qaeda, the vast majority of these people actually don't want to live in a 7th century caliphate. They want to live in a modern nation state where they can vote for their leaders, and this sort of convulsion that you're seeing in the region there, I think, is the biggest testament to that idea. And it's really, it's very different. It's very difficult for Washington to know how to tread here, because if you remember, Condoleezza Rice went to Egypt, castigated Mubarak for putting Ayman Noor in jail. He was one of the Egyptian dissidents, said that if you really want democracy, you need to let this man out, and then backtracked when she realized that for Egypt, democracy might mean the Muslim Brotherhood. Depends on what the American idea of democracy is. So American democracy to an Egyptian or to a Tunisian or to a Libyan might mean a dictator, because that secures America's strategic interests in the region. So what you might see as democracy isn't something that your average Jordanian or Syrian might see as democracy. To me, I feel like, and we talk about this quite a lot in my office, the strategy that Obama has taken with Libya has been sort of pitch perfect, and is leading from behind and dealing with, not wanting to get too involved and allowing NATO to take the lead. America cannot be seen to be influencing these uprisings, because then they'll be tainting them. And in Iraq is a perfect example of that. Afghanistan is a perfect example of that. Karzai is America's man, so therefore he's not popular in
Did
Afghanistan.
you get the gas with the earthquake? I don't remember, I thought it came around the same time, so.
And anyways, so it's very difficult for them to be seen to be doing too much without it influencing the domestic political factors. If they want to do anything, they stick to humanitarian aid, be very careful where the money goes. Obviously, the biggest sort of problem that people have with the Libyan issue is funding these rebels, but people have to remember they're actually funding them with Gaddafi's own money, so it's not actually coming out of anybody's pocket. So that, it's a very delicate thing that they're doing here, and it's also, Tunisia's on its way. Tunisia, I think, is okay, right, Victor?
Inshallah.
But then you look at Syria. The entire world is watching Syria just go up in flames, and no one is saying boo, because they can't sanction him, really. The oil goes to Europe, so it's really a European thing. There's really not a lot Washington can do. So it is difficult. In Bahrain, obviously the Saudis are in there oppressing any kind of uprising. It's such a dysfunctional place, but I'm very hopeful that these regimes won't last for very long.
I think Tunisia has a real shot. I'm keeping my fingers triple crossed for Egypt, which is a much harder place.
Egypt, the proof is in the pudding, as we say, where I come from. I don't know if you say that.
So could I just finish then? It's not whether it's a dictatorship or not, it's just if we support the dictator.
Well,
that's what it is.
what do you mean?
Well, like we were
Our
okay
hypocrisy shows.
this year, Egypt, and, Tunisia, no problem, and then all of a sudden Libya. We don't like the dictator in Libya. We came down on him, but in other dictatorships, if they're giving us, maybe a good price on oil, we give them weapons.
Yes, it's strategic interests.
Okay.
It's regional stability.
In the green,
Thanks.
right behind.
Oh, yes. One of the things I'd like you to talk about is kind of the dark side of 9/11, the aftermath. For example, the Patriot Act, rendition, torture, Guantanamo, Abu Ghraib, and the becoming more of a national security state in terms of not just looking for terrorists, but even greater surveillance. of the
Security
American
versus
people.
civil liberties.
Yeah, so I'd like to hear more about that, because to me, I think there's a very dangerous element to this. And the last part of that is that the fact that nobody has really been held accountable for really anything, except maybe low-level soldiers, but none of the higher-ups who helped orchestrate, from Dick Cheney on down, nobody's held accountable.
Nobody was held accountable above a certain level at Abu Ghraib. But I'm hoping that Kenneth can talk about that. You must have seen it in New York.
Well, I was just gonna say that, the people who defend waterboarding and rendition and those things tend to be people who are not at risk at all themselves of whatever happening to them. Most military officers are against that, because they realize that their own men will someday be captured. And that we always want to argue that, well, Americans don't do that. We have a very difficult moral position to be in now, having obviously done it ourselves. And so I think most American generals have been opposed to it, but they're not the ones making policy. People like Cheney and Bush, that's a political position, I'm sorry to say it, but I do think I do think it's disgusting, and I think it's not worthy of the United States to have to do things like that. It's exactly the argument that the Gestapo used in Paris, or in France, or any occupied place in World War II. These people are terrorists, they're disturbing the peace, and it's therefore quite proper and okay for us to use extraordinary measures, including torture and execution, to maintain peace. I don't see a bit of difference in that argument and what we argue. It's safety of our citizens, and therefore whatever we do to the people we suspect. By the way, suspect. They're not convicted of anything. We just suspect them. They might have been walking around somewhere, and suddenly we catch them in a sweep, and we think they're, I'm sure there's some bad people there who deserve what they've gotten, but I do think that we need to, the test of a democracy, the test of a great nation, is how you behave under stress. It's easy to hold up high ideals as long as there's no dissent. It's much more difficulty in a time of danger to hold up your ideals. But I think those are the kind of things that would make us proud a half century from now.
The flip side to that question is how this country is dealing with the intolerance toward certain populations, like Muslim population. Do you think that relative to some of the European nations, the U.S. has done okay or not?
Well, there's no answer to what you're saying. I mean, think this. I do think that one of the great things about the United States is that being an American is self-definition. Anybody in the room, you tell me an American, it's good enough for me. But it's very hard to become French, or become British, or become German. And so many of these newcomer groups and these European countries are treated are called French, but in fact they're not French, and they're made to believe all the time that they're not French. Detroit has a huge Arab population, Muslim population. They're, at least so far, have not generated much protest because they're trying to become Americans. They want to make it. We accept people. So I think right now, again, it's a little bit Pollyannish, but basically the structure of our nation, that we never were one religion, one race, one anything else, in a sense it benefits us now. And that's why what you said about they want a green card. Because at the end of the day, they know that if they come to America, if you've got a turban on, people aren't going to love you. But if you're driving a taxi in New York, nobody gives a damn. They just want to get from here to there. And so, if you work hard enough, you can make it. You're not held back. You're not held back by your religion. Now, again, we all know that there are exceptions to this. I'm not saying it's perfect. But we probably are more perfect about this than most anybody else. And I think it's something that we should hold on to.
I think there was such a trauma from that event, and there was an overcorrection. I think we realized we were too trusting as a country and let our guard down. Part of the exhibit here shows artifacts and talks about the 1993 bombing in the World Trade Center, in the parking garage underneath, and supposedly learned something from that, but we really didn't. So then this happened, and we just did a, completely, overcorrected. It happened right here in our backyard on Central Avenue. I've written about this story just up the street. I had interviewed this interesting pizza maker on Central Avenue about 4 months before the FBI rounded him up in a sting under questionable circumstances with the imam. They're both still in prison. New York Times did some terrific reporting this past week on this rogue unit with CIA and NYPD where they were doing surveillance, rounding up a lot of kind of anti-Muslim backlash without, proper grounds. And so I think all over this country, at the airports we see it, there's now a lot of evidence that taking off the shoes and some of the things they do are not really practical. Other countries don't do them. We're just kind of overreacting to let people feel like they're safe. So I don't know that a lot of this surveillance led to being safer or good policing. I think it was a knee-jerk, emotional overreaction in a lot of ways. And a lot of people are in prison, including the two gentlemen here from Albany, under questionable circumstances.
Yeah.
Last night at the Republican debate, they talked a lot about immigration, and one of the candidates, I forget who it was, if it was Perry or somebody, talked about building a wall. Actually, it might have been John Huntsman. Building a wall.
I think it was Perry.
Was it Perry? It was Perry? In any event, doesn't matter. How does that, either a real wall or that sort of psychological wall, which I think you kind of get into, how do you balance that? Because we're talking around the overshooting the mark. How do we figure it out? You know, Canada doesn't seem to have as much of an issue with having immigrants come in and get green cards in high technology areas or engineering. So how do we as a society going forward balance, you know, the need for immigration and economic growth with this nature of security? How do we do it?
Well, first of all, we're an immigrant nation. There are precious few of us who are Indians or where we're from. So all of us, that's who we're talking about here. And I think that one of in a way, the real war we're in, and by the way, I object to the term war. If you call the war on terrorism a war, what do you call the Eastern Front in World War II? We have 30 million people killed in a vast war that lasts 4 years, thousands of planes and tanks. We just moved words down by calling everything a Holocaust. I mean, it's the problem with that. But nevertheless, I think we need to constantly be aware that we benefit from immigration. China, Japan has already shifted into reverse. Joel Kotkin wrote a book called The Next 100 Million, which argues that the United States is going to do well in the next 50 years because we're a growing society. That we are, in fact, bringing all these people in, turning them to Americans in a growing place. And by the way, the Chinese are making hay while we're worried about Iraq and Afghanistan, and spending whatever it is, hundreds of billions of dollars. They're not spending all that money. They're doing a lot better. So put me down as in favor of immigration.
Anybody else in favor of immigration?
Well, we Australians also. We're a nation of immigrants too, but you know, disturbingly, we don't have walls, but we have waters, and Australia is very disturbing right now. They actually just had a ruling that they couldn't use Malaysia as their dumping ground for asylum seekers trying to come to Australia, so they are now going to go back to using Pacific Islands of Nauru and some other places as you know, and we're talking detention camps for people because they're crossing treacherous waters to come to Australia, and Australians are putting them in detention camps, and it is disgraceful. And as an Australian, I'm deeply, deeply ashamed of that. And you know, it touches a xenophobic nerve and a fear of the other. And you know, this whole idea that they're taking our jobs, they're threatening our way of life, that doesn't belong in this day and age, in a place like Australia that is made up of 1,000 different nationalities. It's so disgusting to me. I just live here forever. It's a refrain that we've heard here over and over again.
I just had a vivid reminder of a trip I did for the Times Union to Northern Ireland after the Good Friday Peace Accords, and we spent a lot of time in Belfast and in Derry and looking at people locally whose families were kind of, some of them lost family members and divided by the Troubles. And I remember at the Peace Wall in Belfast, this big wall they built between the Irish and the Protestants in this kind of always warring neighborhoods I'm trying to remember the Falls Road, I think it was. And these kids, we were walking around interviewing people, taking pictures, Steve Jacobs, a photographer, and these kids were throwing rocks at each other over the wall. And I stopped and asked one kid, hey, what's going on? You know, what are you guys fighting about? What are you doing? He said, we don't know, but our parents did it, so we do it. And they built these walls thinking it was going to make it a better place, and they just find other ways to get at each other. And it was the absurdity. I thought I was in a Beckett or a Pinter play or something. It is tragic. You know?
I just want to, just for a moment, I want to emphasize this issue. One of the things that I think gives America this advantage, to echo what my colleagues here say, is the diversity and the possibility of acceptance. And statistically, actually, we do much better with our immigrants than Europe does. There have been a lot less terrorist attacks in the United States from an immigrant population than in Western Europe for these very reasons. And I wasn't kidding before when I said the Civil Rights Act really made a difference. And when we lose that, and this gets back to your original question, we push away from treating everyone as equal. We create our own problems. And you should just ask Genghis Khan how well Great Wall of China worked.
And by the way, you notice that most of the people who have shot up high schools and stuff like that are very homegrown terrorists. usually white, male, stuff like this.
That's for an entirely other forum.
I've got some good stuff on that.
My question to each of you is, do you think that September 11th exacerbated what appears to be a cold civil war that's going on in American society, and also, as Jamie mentioned, in Australian society and in Canadian society, and sort of hardening of the cultural divide as well?
It didn't have to.
Okay. Do you think it caused that, exacerbated it, interrupted something that was going to happen anyway?
Do you think it's still happening?
Well, there's an argument that the Iraq War would have happened regardless. When you talk about jingoism in the media, it definitely became if you criticized, you weren't American. If you didn't agree, you weren't American. If you didn't support war, you weren't American. So there was a definite, if you don't stand with us or against us, and nothing is black and white. Nothing is black and white in this.
Tell me if I'm wrong, but don't you have, are you talking about the cultural divide in America?
Yes.
Well, I think New York State and City have something to be proud of here. Both Governor Cuomo and Mayor Bloomberg, both in so many words, have said this is a sanctuary state and a sanctuary city. Somewhere in the Republican debate last night, somebody attacked that notion. But if you go back 30 years, 40 years, the Bronx was in the same direction as Detroit, and some parts of Brooklyn. Now there are 3 million legal, that we count, foreign-born people just in the city of New York, and we know now they go first to the suburbs and other places. Those people have revitalized the city of New York. Take away those immigrants, and they have made us stronger and wealthier and healthier. Take away those 3 million people just from the city. That's not the people hiding under the bed and telling their sister they're not there. Those people stood up and were counted. So we know it's an even bigger number than that. I mean, it's been an enormous benefit, I think, to New York City.
Who do you think invented Google?
While you guys are here, I think that your question is even bigger than 9/11. If I'm off the mark, just say. But there seems to be one side of America that is represented by, let's say, an anti-intellectualism, evolution is a theory that's out there kind of thing.
Global warming is a theory.
Okay, yeah, global warming is a theory. They're all just theories, really. And then it's just this new element of the Tea Party that is dividing the American political dialogue. Is that something, is that just a reaction to something? And if it is, to what? No.
I mean, I personally, I have basically just sort of dipped my toe in the pool that is American politics, so I cannot speak with any sort of authority at all, but I always feel that when people adhere to their own sort of truths that are comfortable to them, it's because they're afraid of changing or confronting reality, and that's very psychoanalytical, and I could be completely off base, but I think this is more a question that everybody else in this room is much more qualified than me to answer.
I can tell you a moment when I felt this country in the same way that we were talking about the way New York came back and the world really wanted to put its arms around New York after 9/11. I had this feeling. I was standing out on that blustery cold day during the inauguration of Barack Obama as president near the Washington Monument, about the exact middle of 1 million people crowded in tight on a cold, terrible day, and it could have gotten really ugly. I did not, in my reporting, see anybody push, get violent. It was the most diverse crowd I've ever seen. People who I talked to had very little money. They came on buses, they came in vans. There were people of color, poor people from the South who, you know, could sit there at the Lincoln Monument where Martin Luther King gave that speech, and it hit them so powerfully. And that moment, that day was so beautiful. It was peaceful, it was moving, and to think it was only, what, a little over 3 years ago, we seem to have completely lost that. It seemed like that moment when the world was with us. This was a moment when this country came together. I mean, race, class, everything in that mall with 1 million people, and somehow it's been squandered. We've lost it. But I had that feeling like, wow, this country, and this leader in particular, with his message at the time, we were going somewhere. It was really going to change. It really was change. It felt on that day like nothing I'd felt in anything I've seen, and it was powerful. And then it was pretty quickly gone for a lot of
During
reasons.
another forum, we might want to analyze what it was
Right.
that tore it apart, but up there?
Yeah, I have a question. In the past few years, there was an attempt to build a mosque near Ground Zero, and these attempts were denied. So my question to you is this a matter of respect to those who died on 9/11, or is this a matter of intolerance and unwillingness on New York's part to recognize who their enemies are?
There are actually like 4 mosques closer to Ground Zero than that building.
We should take them all away. No, what I find amusing is that in the same street where they're planning to build a mosque currently, there's a porn shop and a McDonald's and a liquor store. And I think these are great American traits. And I think 9/11, Christians died on 9/11, Jews died on 9/11, Muslims died on 9/11, and not just the hijackers. And I think when we, again, when we say these are the bad guys because they're Muslim, if you want to say these are the bad guys because they're jihadists, or these are the bad guys because they're Islamists and they want to kill us, I'm okay with that. But to classify an entire group of people and say these are the bad guys, it hurts us. And I want to go back to the point we were talking to about, you know, this is the right thing to do. Norms have power. My colleague David Rousseau, norms have power and we can use them. So it's not just about doing the right thing, it's also about doing the smart thing. And when we don't follow certain norms, we hurt ourselves. And we have been doing it all. When we say you can't build a mosque in this area of New York, people look at us around the world and they say, you guys are anti-Muslim. When U.S. politicians come up and say, we are going to do an interview in Capitol Hill on the Muslim problem, that's a problem. Do an interview on the terrorist problem. You were talking before about threats from American terrorists. We are blessed with many locally domestic, homegrown American terrorists who want to kill people, who think, agree with people that Islam is evil, but they also want to kill you too. And so we need to think more broadly about the threat, not just myopically about one group, and not just because of a certain ideology, but we need to think about the threat that comes from the whole spectrum and not demonize anyone simply because of who they are.
The mosque at Ground Zero was a very interesting point. Craig Williams, I know a lot of family members that we work with, and I was really surprised with that one, where the opinion on that would cross lines. I talk about it with somebody who would clearly think, there's probably many people who think it's an okay thing to have the mosque there, and that person would say, absolutely not, it's the wrong thing, and surprised me. I don't know if that was your experience, Ron. There's people on the ground in New York. It's also a little known fact, never went out in the press, we have a piece of airplane that went through that building. From ceiling.
London, it was a Burlington coat factory.
That's right.
Building. I did a story on it for NPR, and it was very interesting because they also had survivors or victims or families of victims part of their community group who were lobbying to get this built. So you're right. I mean, you get both sides.
That's
people who are for and people who are just completely not.
I interviewed Governor Pataki last week on the 10th anniversary of 9/11. I asked him that question. He was the governor at the time. That week I was there, I was with him and Giuliani a lot. He was the state's presence there, and he was very adamant, absolutely not. He thinks it's an affront. He has 2 sons in the military. He would give no ground on that issue. And I think that probably represents a lot of Americans too. So I think it's still very raw for a lot of people.
But this is a generation, we talked about the media and the blogosphere and all these other things. We should note that this mosque was being built for a long time and talked about being created for a long time. Nobody cared until some aspects of the blogosphere labeled it. The key difference was it was relabeled as the mosque at ground zero. And when it's A, it's not a mosque, and B, it's not at ground zero, and C, it was labeled as both of these things. And it was the labeling and marketing of this as the mosque at ground zero that changed the entire dynamic. Until it was labeled in such a way, I think the key person in this was Pamela Geller. Until it was done by Pamela Geller, it simply flew under the radar screen because, as you said, there were mosques already there.
It was going to be built on the ashes of the victims. I mean, this is how it was phrased. It is like 4 blocks. It's a community center as well as, and
Words count.
Well, I think this is an argument for a more careful study of American history and politics, because as we know from the Federalist Papers, the Bill of Rights, and the Constitution, it's not a matter you take a vote about something like this.
Right.
It's a matter you have an absolute right to do it. And that's what we're supposed to protect in the United States. The odd person, the person who is a dissenter. And that's why you have a Bill of Rights, not because to protect the majority.
Can I
So
vote
that's
for
what
him?
we tested.
All right, I know. We can take one more question, right there.
Okay. As you said, we find another way to do it. Why are we, well, anyway, I think we're being kept in fear by the government. The planes should not be a problem. If they want to have terrorist attacks, there's many ways to do it. As you say, go into the stadium in Michigan with a plane.
Well, one of us could have brought a bag in here tonight and blown us
That's
all.
right. That woman
I
walked
mean, if you
in
just
with a
want to kill
backpack.
some people.
Just go in a subway car.
you could have tackled her.
Put them on these that go through Albany.
But don't you think everyone sort of, I mean, I think one of the things about having the planes hijacked, people thought they were going to land them.
Right.
And that changed after 9/11. They thought, okay, maybe these guys are going to negotiate, maybe they're going to make some demands, we'll see what they want to say. Then when you realize they're not actually planning on, landing these planes, there's no tolerance. I mean, you're on I've gone on to planes with people and somebody is just a little loud or a little, people just like, everybody. I've never, everybody is super vigilant. I mean, I don't know, that's my experience, but I can see an entire plane tackling somebody if they so much as, light like a shoe on fire.
But we also have to give credit.
Outraged.
But we also have to give credit to the tremendous challenge that the police and the security personnel face. Because on the one hand, we want civil rights and we don't want these things on us. On the other hand, if there's another 9/11, if there's a Mumbai or something like that, who are we going to blame? We're going to blame these guys. And so I would say that they have this enormous challenge. And I think that in many times they haven't done a good job at balancing. But it's hard to balance. And I think some states are doing a better job at this balancing game than others.
Yeah, but we're going after airplanes. Drive through Lincoln Tunnel.
They actually were planning that.
We're actually going to have to wrap it up, sir. But there was one thing that you said yesterday, Victor, about before 9/11, we didn't have a lot of imagination. And after 9/11, the U.S. government fought the imagination that it needed.
That was actually Carr.
Oh, sorry.
But he's smarter than I am. And yes, before 9/11, it's not this. One of the big myths is we never thought of this. As a matter of fact, there were plenty of people who would sketch this out, but there was a tremendous lack of creativity in thinking about these challenges. After 9/11, there's been a lot of creativity and, unfortunately, a little bit of over-imagination. And making a balance there between the over-imagination and being creative and smart, I'm glad I'm not a policymaker because it's an awfully hard thing to do.
I want to thank everybody, including the State Museum and the Rockefeller College of Public Affairs and Policy for creating this forum and for giving our community a safe space to talk about these issues, which don't get talked about a lot, especially with such an incredible group of panelists. Mark Shannon, Kenneth Jackson, Jamie Terabay, Paul Grondal, Victor Asal. You guys are just terrific. And thank you very much.